Imagine marching through a desert under the scorching sun, wearing 70 lbs of metal armor that's slowly turning into an oven. Your tongue is swollen, your lips are cracked and bleeding, and every breath feels like inhaling fire. You see a lake in the distance, but you can never reach it. Around you, thousands of knights are collapsing, tearing off their helmets to breathe, only to have their faces burned by the sun. Some are so desperate they're cutting open horses to drink their blood. This isn't a nightmare. This was the Battle of Hatin in 1187, where Saladin turned the desert itself into a weapon and cooked 20,000 crusaders alive in their own armor. The Kingdom of Jerusalem had been standing for almost 90 years when everything went wrong in a single summer. The Crusader states were a thin strip of land on the eastern Mediterranean coast, surrounded by Muslim territories on all sides. They had survived this long through a combination of military skill, fortified castles, and the constant arrival of new crusaders from Europe. But by 1187, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Saladin had united Egypt and Syria under his rule, and now he was tightening the noose around the Christian kingdoms. The Crusaders knew a major confrontation was coming, but they had no idea it would be their complete annihilation. The disaster began with a woman's scream. On May 1st, Saladin's forces attacked a caravan near the town of Nazareth and captured the wife of an important Crusader lord. When news reached Jerusalem, King Guy of Lusignan faced an impossible choice. Every military advisor told him not to march into the desert during summer. The heat was deadly, water sources were scarce, and Saladin controlled the territory. But the pressure was overwhelming. The captured noble woman was related to powerful families. The entire kingdom was calling him a coward, and his political rival, Reynald of Chatillon, was openly mocking him. Guy made the fatal decision. He would lead the entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem into the desert to confront Saladin. The Crusader army that assembled at Sephoria was the largest military force the Kingdom of Jerusalem had ever gathered. 20,000 fighting men answered the call, including 200 heavily armored knights mounted on war horses. These weren't just soldiers, they were the entire military strength of the Crusader states concentrated in one place. Every castle was left with minimal garrison. Every town sent its defenders. They brought the true cross itself, the holiest relic in Christendom, believing God would grant them victory. The army was so large it took hours just to form up in marching order. What none of them realized was that they were marching to their deaths. Raymond of Tripoli, the most experienced military commander in the Crusader states, begged King Guy to reconsider. Raymond had fought in the region for decades and knew desert warfare intimately. He warned that Saladin was deliberately baiting them into a trap that marching in July heat would kill more crusaders than any battle. He proposed an alternative strategy: stay near water sources, force Saladin to attack fortified positions, make the Muslims exhaust themselves in the heat instead. But Guy was surrounded by hot-headed younger knights who called Raymond a coward and possibly a traitor. They accused him of being afraid to fight, of caring more about his own lands than defending Christendom. The peer pressure in that command tent was so intense that Guy overruled his best advisor and committed to the march. On July 2nd, the Crusader army left the springs of Sephoria and began marching east toward the town of Tiberias. The plan was to cover 69 mi across barren hills and reach the Sea of Galilee by nightfall, where they could access water. It was a brutally hot summer day, and the men were already sweating inside their armor before they even started walking. The knights wore chainmail from neck to knee covered by heavy cloth surcoats to prevent the metal from heating up too much. Over this they wore their helmets and carried shields, swords, and lances. Infantry wore less armor, but carried heavy weapons and supplies. Every man was essentially wearing his own personal furnace. The armor that was supposed to protect the Crusaders was designed for European climates. Chainmail consists of thousands of interlocking metal rings that trap heat against the body. Beneath the mail, knights wore thick padded tunics to prevent the rings from cutting into their skin. Then came the mail itself, then the cloth surcoat over that. In a European summer, this was uncomfortable but manageable. In the Palestinian desert in July, it was a death sentence. Within the first hour of marching, the temperature inside the armor was already reaching 100 degrees. The metal rings were conducting heat directly onto the skin. The padding underneath was soaked with sweat that had nowhere to evaporate. Knights were essentially being slow-cooked inside their own protective gear. Saladin had been waiting for this moment. His scouts reported the Crusader movements immediately, and he smiled when he heard they had left Sephoria. The Crusaders had fallen directly into his trap. Saladin had over 20,000 men of his own, mostly light cavalry archers, who were born in the desert and knew how to fight in the heat. His strategy was simple and devastating. He would harass the Crusader column constantly, never allowing them to rest or drink while driving them away from any water sources. Then, when they were exhausted and dying of thirst, he would destroy them completely. He sent his cavalry to shadow the Crusader army, staying just out of reach but close enough to shoot arrows constantly. The harassment began almost immediately after the Crusaders left Sephoria. Muslim cavalry appeared on the hills around them, shooting arrows into the column and then retreating before the knights could charge. The Crusaders had to keep moving forward in formation, unable to chase their attackers while arrows rained down continuously. Men started falling with arrows in their necks, legs, and backs. The heat was becoming unbearable. Inside the armor, temperatures were rising to intolerable levels. Knights began experiencing heat exhaustion after just a few hours of marching. Their padded undergarments were soaked with sweat, but the sweat couldn't evaporate through the metal, so they were essentially steaming inside their own armor. The psychological torture was as effective as the physical suffering. The Crusaders could see the Sea of Galilee shimmering in the distance, its blue water clearly visible on the horizon. They knew salvation was just hours away if they could reach it. But Saladin's cavalry kept pushing them off course, forcing them to take longer routes around hills, constantly adding distance to their march. Every time the Crusaders tried to angle toward water, Muslim archers would concentrate their fire from that direction, forcing them back onto the waterless route. The men could see their destination, but were being systematically prevented from reaching it. This kind of psychological warfare broke men's spirits faster than any weapon. By midday, the Crusader army was in serious trouble. They had covered less than half the distance to the Sea of Galilee, and men were already collapsing from heat stroke. The column kept stopping and starting as exhausted soldiers fell out of formation. Horses were dying from the heat and lack of water, their bodies left behind on the trail. The constant arrow attacks were taking a psychological toll as well. Men were terrified, exhausted, and desperately thirsty. But they couldn't stop to rest because Saladin's cavalry would surround them immediately. King Guy realized they would never reach Tiberias. But it was too late to turn back. They were trapped in the middle of the desert with no water. The first signs of heat madness began appearing in the early afternoon. Knights started hallucinating, seeing water where there was none, or seeing their families calling to them from the hills. Some began speaking in tongues or praying frantically, convinced they were being punished by God for their sins. Others became violent, attacking their fellow Crusaders in confused rage. One knight reportedly went completely mad and charged alone at the Muslim lines, screaming that he could see angels. He was immediately shot full of arrows and died 50 yards from his own army. His body was left where it fell, and the Crusaders had to march past it. A grim preview of what awaited them all. As the sun reached its peak, something even worse happened. Saladin's men set fire to the dry grass and brush around the Crusader army. Thick black smoke rolled across the hills, making it even harder to breathe. The flames added more heat to an already hellish situation. Knights were gasping for air through smoke-filled helmets, their lungs burning. Some began tearing off their helmets despite the danger from arrows because they literally couldn't breathe. Their faces immediately started blistering from sun exposure. The combination of extreme heat, heavy armor, smoke, and constant arrow fire was breaking the army's will to fight before the real battle had even begun. The Crusaders stumbled forward through the afternoon, leaving a trail of dead and dying men behind them. When they finally reached the village of Hattin, King Guy made the decision to stop for the night. Even though they were still miles from water, the army was falling apart. Men were hallucinating from dehydration. Some were drinking their own urine. Others were slaughtering horses and trying to drink the blood. But horse blood is thick and salty and only made their thirst worse. The knights who tried this vomited immediately, wasting what little fluid remained in their bodies. That night, camped on the dry hills near Hattin, the Crusader army could see the Sea of Galilee in the distance, its water glittering in the moonlight, completely unreachable. During that terrible night, the camp descended into chaos. Men were crying, praying, and arguing about what to do next. Some wanted to make a desperate night march to the Sea of Galilee, but the commanders knew they would be slaughtered in the darkness. Others wanted to surrender immediately, but surrendering 20,000 men in the middle of the desert was impossible. A few knights tried to sneak away individually to find water or escape, but Saladin's men had surrounded the entire camp. Those who tried to leave were either killed by Muslim patrols or captured and brought back to be executed in front of their comrades as a warning. The Crusaders were trapped in an open-air prison with no food, no water, and no hope. Saladin's army surrounded them during the night, cutting off any chance of escape. The Crusaders could hear Muslim soldiers shouting and beating drums. a psychological torture that prevented anyone from sleeping. Some men tried to sneak away to find water, but they were killed or captured in the darkness. When dawn broke on July 4th, the Crusaders woke up to a nightmare. They had no water. They were completely surrounded, and the temperature was already rising. Many men were so dehydrated they couldn't even stand. Their tongues were swollen to twice their normal size. Their lips were cracked and bleeding. Some had started bleeding from their noses and gums as their bodies began shutting down from dehydration. The morning brought fresh horror as men discovered what dehydration had done to them overnight. Knights tried to put on helmets they had removed during the night, but their heads had swollen so much the helmets wouldn't fit. Men tried to grip their swords, but found their hands were cramping uncontrollably from electrolyte depletion. Some Crusaders had gone blind during the night, their eyes dried out and damaged beyond repair. Others discovered they could no longer urinate because their bodies had no fluids left to expel. The most disturbing were the men who seemed fine, but were actually in the final stages of heat stroke, walking and talking normally while their internal organs were failing. These men would suddenly collapse dead without warning. The battle itself was less a fight and more an execution. Saladin attacked at dawn before the Crusaders could even form up properly. His cavalry charged from all directions simultaneously, shooting arrows into the disorganized Crusader lines. The Crusader knights tried to mount their horses for a countercharge, but many of the horses were dead or too weak to carry armored men. Those who did manage to mount up found they were too exhausted and dehydrated to fight effectively. When they tried to charge, they moved slowly and clumsily, easy targets for the Muslim archers. Knights who fell from their horses couldn't get back up because the armor was too heavy and they were too weak. The few successful cavalry charges that the Crusaders managed were pathetic compared to their usual devastating impact. Normally, a charge of armored knights was like a steel avalanche that could break any infantry line, but at Hattin, dehydrated men on dying horses could barely manage a trot. Muslim cavalry simply rode away from these slow charges, then circled back to shoot arrows at the knights from behind. One group of Templar knights managed to reach Muslim lines, but were so exhausted they could barely swing their swords. Muslim soldiers simply pulled them off their horses and slit their throats on the ground. The knights were too weak to resist. The infantry broke first. The common soldiers, already terrified and dying of thirst, ran toward the high ground of the Horns of Hatin, twin peaks overlooking the battlefield. They thought they might find water there, or at least a defensible position. But there was no water, and Saladin's men surrounded the peaks immediately. The infantry was trapped on the hilltops with no way down and no supplies. They could only watch as the knights below were systematically slaughtered. Some of the infantry were so desperate they tried throwing themselves off the cliffs, preferring a quick death to slow torture by thirst. Down on the plain, the knights were being destroyed piece by piece. Their heavy armor, which was supposed to protect them, had become their death sentence. Inside the metal suits, temperatures were reaching over 150 degrees. Men were literally cooking inside their own armor. Their skin was blistering against the hot metal. Some knights became so overheated their bodies started convulsing in seizures. Others simply collapsed unconscious and died from heat stroke without ever taking a wound. The few knights who tried to remove their armor were immediately killed by arrows or captured. There was no escape. One chronicler recorded a particularly gruesome scene where a circle of knights huddled together trying to protect each other with their shields. The heat inside their armor was so intense that steam was visibly rising from the gaps in their armor. One by one, the knights collapsed from heat stroke until only a single knight remained standing, literally surrounded by the steaming bodies of his dead comrades. He reportedly stood there swaying for several minutes, unable to move or speak, before finally falling dead himself. When Muslim soldiers later examined these bodies, they found the knight's skin had actually fused to the metal of their armor in places where the heat had been most intense. King Guy and his closest commanders made a desperate last stand around the true cross. They planted the holy relic in the ground and formed a tight circle of knights around it, shields locked together. For a few hours they held, even though men were dying from heat and thirst inside the formation. But eventually their circle grew smaller and smaller as knights collapsed. When a Muslim soldier finally grabbed the true cross and carried it away, the last bit of hope died. The Crusaders believed God had protected them, but now their holiest relic was in enemy hands. Many simply gave up fighting and fell to their knees, waiting for death. The moment the true cross fell was devastating to Crusader morale. This wasn't just a battle standard or a symbol. It was believed to be a piece of the actual cross on which Christ was crucified. Crusaders thought it made them invincible in battle, that God himself protected any army that carried it. When they saw a Muslim soldier running away with their holiest relic held above his head like a trophy, something broke in the Crusaders' collective psyche. Knights who had been fighting desperately suddenly stopped resisting. Men threw down their weapons and started praying for their souls instead of fighting for their lives. The psychological impact of losing the true cross was almost as destructive as the physical effects of heat and thirst. By noon, the battle was over. The entire Crusader army had been destroyed in less than 6 hours. The field was covered with bodies of men who had died from heat stroke, dehydration, and wounds. Many knights had torn off parts of their armor in their final moments, desperately trying to cool down before they died. Their faces were grotesquely swollen, their skin purple and blistered. Some had bitten through their own tongues in their madness. The smell of death mixed with the smell of cooked flesh from men who had literally roasted inside their metal armor. It was one of the most horrific battlefield scenes in medieval history. Saladin personally captured King Guy along with the most important nobles. He brought them into his tent and in a famous gesture offered Guy a cup of water cooled with snow from Mount Hermon. Guy drank desperately and then passed the cup to Reinald of Sheshan, the man whose actions had helped provoke this disaster. Saladin immediately stopped him. In Muslim custom, offering water to a prisoner meant you promised them safety, but Saladin had made no such promise to Reinald. He accused Reinald of breaking treaties and attacking Muslim pilgrims. Then Saladin personally drew his sword and struck Reinald, either killing him or wounding him, so his guards could finish the execution. Guy watched in horror, thinking he was next, but Saladin told him not to worry. "Kings don't kill," he said. But Reinald was no king. The captured Templar and hospital knights faced even worse. These were members of military religious orders who had sworn to fight Muslims until death. Saladin considered them the most dangerous enemies and ordered all of them executed. Over 200 captured knights were forced to kneel in rows, while religious scholars and volunteers took turns beheading them. The executions were done clumsily because most of the executioners weren't trained soldiers. Some knights required multiple sword strikes before dying. The executions took hours to complete. The common soldiers who survived faced slavery, sold in markets across the Muslim world. So many Crusader slaves flooded the markets that summer that prices collapsed to almost nothing. The horrors didn't end with the battle. The infantry trapped on the horns of Hattin faced a slower death. Surrounded and without water, they tried to surrender, but Saladin's men were in no hurry to accept. They let the Crusaders suffer for another full day in the heat without water, watching them go mad from thirst. Some Crusaders drank their own blood by biting open their veins, which only accelerated their deaths. Others fought each other over drops of moisture. When surrender was finally accepted, only a fraction of the men on the hilltop were still alive. The rest had died from dehydration, heat stroke, or suicide. The consequences came faster than anyone expected. Within 3 months, Saladin had captured almost every Crusader city in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The castles and towns had no soldiers left to defend them because the entire army had died at Hattin. Jerusalem itself fell in October after a brief siege. The city the Crusaders had held for 88 years was back in Muslim hands. The loss shocked Christian Europe to its core when news of the disaster reached the Pope. He reportedly died of grief. The catastrophe at Hattin directly triggered the Third Crusade, bringing Richard the Lionheart and other European kings to the Holy Land in a desperate attempt to recapture what had been lost. But the Kingdom of Jerusalem never recovered. Even though the Third Crusade recaptured some coastal cities, the Crusader states never regained their former power. Hattin proved that heavily armoured European knights could be defeated through strategy and environmental warfare. Saladin had shown that you didn't need to meet the Crusaders in direct combat. You just needed to choose the right battlefield and let the desert do most of the killing. The battle also demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of pride and poor leadership. King Guy's decision to march into the desert against all military advice destroyed an entire kingdom in a single day. The Battle of Hatin remains one of the most complete military disasters in medieval history. An entire kingdom's army, 20,000 men destroyed in 6 hours through a combination of environmental warfare, tactical brilliance, and the Crusaders' own fatal mistakes. The image of armoured knights literally cooking to death inside their own protective gear, so desperate for water they drank horse blood, has become one of the most haunting episodes of the Crusades. Saladin didn't just win a battle that day. He demonstrated that even the most powerful military force could be destroyed by turning its own strengths into weaknesses. The desert sun, combined with the very armor meant to protect the knights, became the weapon that cooked them alive. Hey everyone, I'm the creator of Savage History. We sincerely appreciate you seeing our most recent video. I sincerely hope you found it entertaining and will return for more. Please take a moment to like the video, subscribe, and leave a comment below with your opinions. It truly means a lot. This channel survives thanks to your comments. I also encourage you to visit Savage Modernity, our new parent channel, where we explore the bloody and intriguing conflicts of the 20th and 21st centuries. The link can be found in the description. I hope to see you there.